So does the rise of terrorist activity in North Africa pose a threat to the West? And should Western nations be doing more to eradicate this threat? Joining me now to offer more insight is Dr. Peter Pham. He's the director of the Michael S. Ansari Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. Dr. Pham also serves on the Senior Advisory Group of the United States Africa Command, which is responsible for U.S. military operations and military relations with 53 African nations. Doctor, thanks so much for coming in. Let's start there. Is this a major threat, and should the West be doing more?
It is a threat to the international community at several levels. Most immediately, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which is the local regional affiliate of Al-Qaeda and its local allies, pose a threat to the countries of the Sahel and the Maghreb, of West Africa and North Africa. They're also providing a safe haven for all sorts of extremists from beyond this region coming there. They pose a threat to the international community beyond Africa in two ways. One, by threatening vital energy supplies. Algeria, for example, where they attacked recently, provides Europe with 1/5 of its natural gas that it consumes in a year. In other parts, they've reached out to other extremist groups in East Africa and going south to the Gulf of Guinea, to Nigeria. So they're a growing threat. And as recently as December, U.S. federal authorities arrested 2 young men in the United States with links to terrorism who were plotting to go and join these people out in northern Mali, receive training, possibly to come back and carry out attacks in America itself.
I want to talk a lot about Mali, but can you give us the playing field? We've heard so much about the drone attacks in Yemen, the attacks in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and of course Al-Shabaab in Somalia. How does this compare, and when you look at the landscape, where are the areas that the West should be concerned?
Well, this area has been a breeding ground for some time. Many of the return fighters who fought the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 1980s, in the 1990s fomented a civil war trying to bring down the Algerian government. They failed in that enterprise, although tens of thousands of Algerians were killed in the crossfire. They then morphed into a terrorist organization, supplied actually the largest number of foreign fighters to Iraq during the period of the U.S. presence in Iraq, then became, about 6 years ago, formally affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and since then have been engaging in all sorts of what I call criminal activities, kidnappings for ransom, protection of drug and narco traffickers, small smuggling. This wasn't because they decided to become criminals. This was to build up a war chest, which has now amounted to tens of millions of dollars, which enabled them last year to spend it on fighters and weapons and seize control at the opportune moment of northern Mali, an area the size virtually of France itself.
And what are the ingredients that make them successful? Because you say there are reasons why they have been effective.
Well, they're operating in an area where borders are very porous. The Sahel runs from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, from North Africa down to sub-Saharan Africa, largely ungoverned. Governments have very difficult asserting authority. Then you've got lots of young men who have very few economic prospects, and the militants, with the money they've made, actually offer to pay them quite handsomely to serve as fighters. So many of them join not because they're extremists. They become radicalized while they're with the group, but they join initially for money. Then finally, there's political marginalization. The Tuaregs, the nomadic people who live in northern Mali, initially rose up not because they wanted to be ruled by extremists, but they were frustrated of years of marginalization and the failure of the Malian government to respect agreements made in the past to give them greater autonomy, to give them greater inclusion, and most importantly, economic development.
So there's that vacuum there. They move in, they seize it, and they capitalize on it. Let me ask about France. Why now?
Well, I think France, which 10% of its population actually hails from this region. The largest Malian community, to be specific, outside Mali is actually just south of Paris. And so France very much felt that it had a tie to this area, not just because it was a former colony, but also because of back and forth communications that it might very well be threatened in the long term. It also felt it had to protect up to 6,000 French nationals who lived in Mali and were threatened by the advance of the Islamists down from the north.
You mentioned to me before we started the program that, to put it simply, this is a script you've read before. I mean, you see the writing on the wall in terms of how this is going to be executed and what's going to happen next. What do you see happening there?
Well, what has happened is the French have intervened, and with overwhelming force, aerial bombardments, the radicals have decided they're not going to fight. They can't fight against that. So they strategically have withdrawn from the cities. The French have now moved in. They proclaimed a success and will quickly are trying to draw down, handing over control to ill-prepared African troops. Then we're going to, then having had their mission accomplished moment, we're going to see all of a sudden mortar attacks, rocket attacks, roadside bombings, a script we've seen in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and other places where these extremists who know the desert better than anyone else, perhaps except the Tuareg nomads, but they know the desert well. They've operated there for years. They have money. They have resources. They will come back and fight asymmetrically. And the forces that will be occupying the towns will basically be reduced to defending garrisons.
Well, the West is pretty good at the shock and awe, this sort of scenario you're describing. Should France stay there longer? I mean, is there the will there to do that?
I think the will over time would wear down. Let's be realistic. France has not fought a sustained war effort of this kind since the Algerian conflict, and France is psychologically still fighting over that legacy. So France has not fought a long war for quite some time, and the Islamists, the radicals, have recruited children. The pictures that might emerge of children being killed by French forces, that would be very bad.
So should the international community be doing more? Is there anything else they can be doing?
I think the international community needs to, one, help the African forces stand up and acquire the training equipment that they need. Secondly, we have to pursue a political process. The only real path that is sustainable is a political process of inclusion in Mali and the economic development that takes away some of the root causes that if they don't force young men into extremism, facilitate their passage into these radical militant groups.
The U.S. has a very limited approach. Secretary Panetta says that's the way it's going to be. Is that the right approach for the United States?
I think at this moment in history, yes, for two reasons. One, America is recovering from 2 long wars. Secondly, as the Defense Secretary nominee, Senator Chuck Hagel, has said, there's not a direct threat to the U.S. in this. There's a more direct threat to France. Thirdly, there is no good option on the ground in Mali. Until there's a legitimate government in Bamako, one that is inclusive, you cannot fight a counterinsurgency. And so finally, we don't have adequate intelligence. France really doesn't have aerial surveillance capabilities in this area. The U.S. has not put them in yet. And until we acquire real actionable intelligence, it would be foolish to rush in.
Let's talk a little bit about the attack in Algeria. 80 people lost their lives. The Islamists say that it was in retaliation for what happened in Mali. Is that your takeaway as well, and what should we read into that?
I think the way the attack was carried out may have been a retaliation, but the attack was prepared long. The attack occurred, remember, just barely a week after the French intervened. There's no way they would have been able to put together an operation as sophisticated as the one they carried out in that short of a period of time. More likely, they'd been planning an operation anyway to seize some hostages. This is the biggest source of funding for these militants, seize Westerners whose governments ransom them for millions of dollars or euros, and that feeds the militants. So they were probably planning to seize some hostages. When France intervened, they decided, well, it changed the nature of the operation. They needed to send a signal, and that's what they did. So it had been long planned out. I think the attack also drove home the fact that Algeria has been playing it both ways. Algeria has been a victim of these terrorists, but at the same time, Algeria for the last 9 months has enabled these terrorists insofar as it's permitted its borders to flow with fuel, fighters, equipment, and other things that have sustained the Islamists up to date.
Listening to you, it's fascinating, but it is also very bleak. It doesn't look like there are a lot of good options in terms of stopping this threat. Are there any good options?
I think there aren't good options. There's a long-term sustainable process that involves political and economic development. until we get to that day, there's only least bad options, which may be, in some cases, eliminating key leaders who hold together the nexus between terror networks, criminal organizations, and tribal structures, and that will put the enemy in disarray, buying the international community some time to do the other things. But we have to realize, and then this is where a little bit of humility on the part of the international community is in order, that ultimately the fate of what happens in Mali, what happens in the Sahel, is in the hands of Malians and their neighbors in Africa. The international community cannot impose a solution. It can manage the situation.
But to get to that point, you don't have a real strong belief that they can manage this situation, though.
Not yet, but I think the international community can contain the threat. Certainly there may be a couple hundred, low thousands of militants in northern Mali, but there are probably only about a dozen who really matter, who hold the whole thing together. Those linchpins, if they are neutralized as threats, the rest are in disarray. That buys some time where perhaps the right assistance to not only the Malians, but also the African forces will be able to make a difference. But you need the time. You have to buy the time.
What about the surveillance drones, this option that the United States has now put on the table? Can that be a game changer? Can it make much of a difference?
I think it is a tremendous step forward in advance insofar as we've been blind to now what is going on there. Now this ability to sustain, in a sustained manner, watch what's going on, gather intelligence, and that's the first. Without information, decisions are proper decisions can't be made. Once the information is gathered, we can look at what options we have.
Peter, one final question before we go to the break. I want to ask you, what do you see as the next potential hotspot?
I think the next hotspot after Mali is probably either the militants can swing either way. This is why this is a very dangerous situation. They can go back north to Algeria and stir things up, and the attack proved that they can. Libya has yet to get its government organized and assert its authority. And in fact, some of the militants, I have information, have actually fled into Libya and no one has been there to stop them. Or they could go south. Nigeria has been fighting an intense insurgency with a local Islamist group, some of whose fighters have received training from Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. Now it might be time to return the favor.
Sounds like a cauldron. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.
We really appreciate your insights. Peter, thanks again.
Thank you.